One of the most interesting, indeed haunting, of the sentences in Martha Gellhorn's letter to me was the comment that England was largely unconcerned and unaffected by AIDS. Now, why would I find that so droll? Well, for one thing, England's antics about John Lennon carried the day so effectively that to this very moment in time, an entire legion of sandbaggers, of podcasters from the alt left, Seattle and Pittsburgh, all side with the people who were behind the attack. They have closed ranks to protect the name Gail Burstyn by media union policing. That's interesting on its own terms. Got a group of people who Martha Gellhorn testified were unconcerned and unaffected, quote unquote, by AIDS, were the ones who carried the day with their antics, getting the victims to side with their own killers. Very interesting on its own terms. So what we're seeing there is something of a dry example of what was known as in diplomatic studies between Russia and America as linkage. You know, Eno talked to Putin and Bush talked to Andropov and Havel negotiated with Zappa. And they put together a union of silence and moved on because the linkage, they were linked by being unconcerned and unaffected. There were people who expressed concern. There was a Soviet scientist named Dr. Reinhard Giesler. But the research into Tacoma's role has shown that back in 1974, the cooperation between Russia and America was being established. So when you look at phenomenon like the TikTok war, and you talk about the post-Soviet world as being a third way, an attempt to negotiate and navigate socialist principles in a post-Stalinist era, having freed socialism from the Soviet Union. What can it do for the betterment of man? Is advocate for the potentials of this linkage, this moving on, this Jeremy Corbyn retinue of don't ask, don't tell about that past atrocity. And this goes back to the Texas school book. So clearly explains why Oswald was being leapfrogged back and forth between Russia and Texas. Bobby Kennedy Jr., that schmuck, was happy to provide the gleam in the eye that he got recounting Khrushchev's idea of the world being an arc. So the Two Virgins Pussy Ball War Game came from pornographers. Jack Ruby's Carousel Club and the Beatles cooperated in creating what John Lennon advertised as Two Virgins and then ducked out. He gave the name to a war game that was programmed back in the days of Sergei Eisenstein's Immoral Memories, is what he calls his autobiography, Immoral Memories. The idea that you should be able to tax the people who come to the Carousel Club under the guidelines of fundamentalist invasive psychology, deadbeat womanizers. And they lewdly abused me. But because AIDS was an extravagant cooperation of the fundamentalist mind with rivals engaged in compromise. Once somebody starts talking about your girlfriend, their goal is to get her away from you, to steal her from you. So this is the idea of character assassination psychology. Now, of course, I made the connection, and to a lesser extent, so did Martha Gellhorn. She was a battlefield Shiska. She was well known by her own admission to sleep with soldiers at the front. She said because it meant so much to them and meant so little to me, and they were often enough going to their deaths. She was a lovely, lovely woman. And the time that she slept with me from the front, so to speak, she sent me a long letter in her 80s from Belize, was shortly after the Berlin Wall came down. So she was setting the stage for the preservation of recognition of what Mount Desert Island had been, and the antagonists were Peter Gabriel, Netanyahu, and Martin Scorsese. They set up a sleazy hootenanny, mocking my sexuality, eventually chemically castrating me, inflicting me with Parkinson's, and brushing me off as water under the bridge, right? So they did this with this contraption about Lenin. They put, when Kamila Valieva fell for fourth place, they put the Japanese woman in third. So Japan wins the Third World War, which was the two virgins Pussyball clock to the AIDS attack. And Crowhead Ragusa, who calls herself Yoko Ono, snuck up from behind and leveled me with a malicious and dishonorable backstab when Amanda Harcourt was contacting me at the Pitt News. And they're sort of working a schizophrenic dog team made up of extreme right-wingers from the Israeli services and transgender people, and just to confuse everything with a mimic system of guerrilla theater. But it's not really that confusing. Britain was unconcerned and unaffected by AIDS. They convinced the victims to side with the status quo that the Beatles represented. And Zappa and Havel helped negotiate the Reagan-Gorbachev alignments that led to the Trumpy-Putin system, where you have down the street the cosmonaut overlooking the supernova. The implications of that are that they turned on the valves of hot war against Gaza and Donbass in the Ukraine simultaneously as a way to remind people of what conventional war does, so that maybe they would accept things like COVID as science dealing with the problems of national politics stresses. And it's very alarming because they're not really representing a movement. They call themselves the Green Party, but they're oil tycoons. They smashed the Exxon Valdez, I remember, when I was in Mount Desert. So it's a gargantuan megalopolin farce. that comes from the strange and weird, deranged ideas of rule. Now, that are prominent in the world. And I just saw some anti-imperialists and a professor from Williams and Mary and a man who's written a relatively honest book about the charade that led to the war in Iraq. And they were saying that Toon can still save his name in history by not going to war against Iran. Well, it takes a lot of gall to admit that Toon covered for Gail Burstyn or was behind the Two Virgins Pussy Ball war game. I mean, when Minori Goto came to Pittsburgh, they had It Takes a Giant on one of their ad boards at Heinz Hall in the program notes. Played I Siciliani Vespers after setting me up with the Sicilian violinist from Youngstown Symphony. So they were cooperating in this production system of the Society for Human Ecology. And of course, the government and the police should take that very seriously. They should issue arrest warrants, and marshals should turn in whoever was responsible for that, including Donald Trump. Because Epstein Island was not the only island of dark repute. Mount Desert Island was a Venus flytrap clock to the AIDS attack. And for all intents and purposes, Russia was in on it. Martha Gellhorn when she said Britain was largely unconcerned and unaffected. Don't get me wrong, the Russians can be very, very spiteful and accusatory. The evidence I found here shows that they were in on it. There was a linkage to put up a smoke screen in the front of being unconcerned and unaffected, just so that it would blow over, I guess is the way they put it. And they used the antagonistic interpretations and the language system, natural language system of Carnegie Mellon University. One of them, Todd Kaufman, is a deranged psychotic. Any time that he hears, like blow over, he thinks Mount Desert, 3 Mile Island. It's really sad to see these scary extremists from the neocon right wing working closely with the left wing, as Peter Shell did, in pulling off this cahooters, this system of an axis of two sides, the sandbaggers going along with what happened. And somehow they found me just like the perfect symbol. Now, why did they think I was the perfect symbol? Well, I'm white. I believe in civil rights and public rights and human rights. In other words, I believe that I can't force somebody to compensate me for my work and my injuries. But I believe in a society where the psychology is in place, where somebody would reward me for my work and my injuries. I believe in that. I'm objectivist enough to believe that a person who works very hard will be compensated. It's not a dirty deal to ask for such compensation. I've lived below the poverty line a long time, and I know one of the reasons why people are so hostile to me is because there's a lot of this bounty about this situation. There's a lot of collectors from Sotheby's making tall tale claims on the art and the souvenirs of it and so on, because that's from butchership in the Navy. So my father wrote a book called Humanizing the Skull, and they thought that's perfect. We'll dehumanize him. And Ken Crimson came from the Gurdjieff Society, where they said, well, if what he wants most is a Shetland pony, we'll give him a Shetland pony. And if what he wants most is a Milanese virgin, we'll give him a Milanese virgin. And then he can stop his crying. And this was their way of covering for the deceit with two virgins in the Two Virgins Pussy Bowl weekend by making it look like a skirmish of under the table casino style decisions by riffraff making tall claims with child pornography and stuff like that. Like the whole business with Jaime Carbonell. Events is, if I had been administrator at the University of Pittsburgh and heard about that tape back in '86 or whatever it was, I would have said, the kid is only 25 years old. Those come from things that happened when he was 13. That's evidence of a brutal, brutal child trafficking ring, which is what it was. It was evident, and even the person who was there on the hand, Andrea Swimmer, was evidence of a brutal, brutal, inside, intimate child trafficking ring, because she was older than me. So you can see perfectly clearly she pushed herself on me. She chased me up a tree with a gang of naked men, literally. So, I mean, I'd like to be able to protect the identities of people like her, but for civics, for the dignity of civics in these issues, but they've made it impossible by their hounding. They try on arguments that come at me through the media, like the Israeli occupation force is trying on the children's clothes of families they vaporize. It's like, how do I look in this stupid argument today, sucker? That's Carnegie Mellon in a nutshell. And Peter Shaw is, fabulously slimy. And he worked with Rusted Root and Brian Eno. I mean, he had quite a cartel working on this situation. So I'm 64 years old. They tortured me. I have Parkinson's. I've been alone for 35 years. The police community, Kash Patel stuff, is like, oh, he looks at pornography. So we'll poison him in the eyes. And the Gurdjieff Society will say amen. And maybe he'll get Putin's autograph. I mean, the fact that this tape exists says something about the courtesy that Martha Gellhorn managed to pay all parties of all sides internationally. She was obviously a very well-respected and endearing person, because my ability to testify about what happened in part comes from the fact that she saw in what I communicated to her a great sense of urgency. Now, it was mocked by Peter Gabriel. It was mocked by Ringo Starr. It was mocked by Megan Dietz. It was mocked by Carnegie Mellon and Donald Trump. But she was right about that. I was deeply concerned about what I had learned on Mount Desert Island about and from a man named Will Zell Brown, who had been talking about a scheme to transform the human race by injecting the blood before AIDS happened. And now I have found that indications show that the filmmaker Diva, a new wave film much loved by the Green Party, which also came out before the AIDS attack, had dialogue and semiotics referring directly to the Texas school book sent to me in 1974, which the evidence I found to comment shows very clearly Russia was in on. There's a style of linkage. It's true that they have committed these assassinations and symbolic acts, but that's because they don't believe any person is more relevant than the great system that they're putting into power. Tracing back to the hooligans of the Italian futurists in Fayoum at the turn of the century, who believed that by controlling media you can control the world. So we're supposed to accept that they tricked us about JFK and believe their story that they're trying to save the world to make it a better place for an arc of colors. Yeah, and it looks much more like the feuding of not very bright people from the margins, squabbling over who gets to call dibs, who gets a claim on um, uh, libels that they've invented, who gets to scare this kid Crary next, because they've done no end of scares, terroristic, terrible scares. They deafened me as a child. And although Pittsburgh is comfortable with words like mistreatment and scare tactics, they're not comfortable with words like torture or mutilation. It was a Manson ordeal. A person isn't made permanently deaf for life by a scare tactic.